Silence is not the absence of something. This is the first thing I want you to understand, because the misunderstanding of silence as absence is the misunderstanding that the 14 men made, the misunderstanding that cost them everything, the misunderstanding that I had spent 27 years cultivating in the people around me, with the specific patience of someone who understood that the misunderstanding was not an error in their thinking, but an investment in mine. Silence is a choice. Every silence is a choice, from the silence of a moment to the silence of a life. And the choosing of it is as active and as deliberate as any other choice a person makes, as active as speaking, as deliberate as acting, as purposeful as any other form of engagement with the world and the people in it. The difference between the silence that is chosen and the silence that is simply the absence of speech is the difference between a weapon and the space where the weapon used to be, and the people who cannot tell the difference between those two things are the people most vulnerable to the one that is actually the weapon. I was that weapon for 27 years. My name is Elias. I am 63 years old. I was born enslaved on a farm in Pittsylvania County, Virginia in the year 1800, the son of a woman named Sarah, who did laundry, and a man named Thomas, who cleared fields and who died of a fever when I was 9 years old, leaving me with a mother who raised me alone and with the specific quality of interior life that the early loss of a parent sometimes produces in a child, the quality of someone who has learned before most people learn it, that the world does not arrange itself for their comfort, and that navigation of the world requires the specific tools of the person navigating it rather than the tools the world offers, the people it has arranged itself for. I stopped speaking when I was 12 years old, not because I lost the capability, not because of any illness or injury, or the specific trauma that produces the inability to speak in people whose voices have been silenced by something done to them. I stopped speaking because I decided to, in the specific deliberate way that a 12-year-old boy who has been paying close attention to the world around him for 3 years since his father's death, decides something that he has been approaching across all 3 of those years without knowing he was approaching it until the day he arrived at it and understood that he had arrived. I arrived at it on a Tuesday in March of 1812, the specific Tuesday when the overseer of the Saunders farm where I was born struck my mother across the face in the kitchen yard for a reason I will not specify, because the reason was not a reason but a pretext. And the pretext is less important than the response it produced in a 12-year-old boy who had been watching the world around him for 3 years with the full attention of someone who understood that attention was what he had. I watched what happened. I watched my mother receive it with the composed face that 20 years of receiving pretexts had made available to her, regardless of what the receiving cost. I watched the overseer walk away, and in the specific moment between the watching of the walking away and the beginning of the next moment, I made the decision. I decided that I was not going to speak to white people anymore, not as a statement of principle, not as a protest, as a strategy, as the specific strategic decision of a 12-year-old boy who had been watching for 3 years how information moved in the world around him, and who had arrived at the understanding that the information most damaging to the people around him was the information that came from them, from their own mouths, from the specific voluntary provision of themselves that speaking to someone always is, and that the most significant thing a person in his situation could withhold was not labor, which could be compelled, or physical resistance, which could be punished, but voice, which was the one thing that could not be extracted from a person who had decided not to give it. I did not speak to a white person again for 27 years. Not one word. Not a yes, sir, or a no, sir, or any of the specific verbal performances of deference that enslaved people provided to the white people around them as the minimum currency of daily interaction in the specific social economy of Pittsylvania County, Virginia, in the 18-teens and 1820s and beyond. Not a word. The performance of silence I gave was complete and consistent and entirely convincing, which is to say that within a year of the decision, the people around me had arrived at the conclusion that I was incapable of speech rather than choosing not to provide it, a conclusion that served my purposes exactly and that I maintained for 27 years, with the specific discipline of someone who understands that the value of a performance depends entirely on its consistency. I spoke to the people I chose to speak to. Other enslaved people, the community of the people I lived among and worked alongside, spoke to them in the full voice that the decision had never removed from me, but that the performance had contained within the specific boundaries I had drawn around it. The decision was not about my voice. It was about who received it. And for 27 years, no white person in Pittsylvania County, Virginia, received it. Until Christmas morning of 1855, when I chose to break the silence in the specific way I had been preparing to break it for 3 years, and the breaking of it did what the silence itself could not have done. I want to describe what 27 years of selective silence built in me, because the building is the most significant thing about what happened on Christmas morning of 1855, and because the building is not what people assume it is when they hear that a man did not speak for 27 years. What people assume is that the silence was a form of suffering, the suffering of someone whose voice had been taken and who endured the taking with the specific quality of mute endurance that the image of a silent slave produces in people who encounter the image of someone who has been reduced to the condition of silence by the weight of what has been done to them and who bears that condition as an additional burden on top of all the other burdens. This is not what my silence was. My silence was not a burden. It was a practice, and the practice was the most productive practice of my life. More productive than any amount of speaking would have been, because the practice produced, across 27 years of its consistent maintenance, the most comprehensive picture of the world around me that the world around me had made available. Silence produces observation. This is the specific mechanism I want you to understand, because the observation is what the silence was for, and the observation was what built the thing that Christmas morning used. When you do not speak, you listen, not in the partial way that people listen when they are also preparing to speak, the listening that is also the preparation of response, the listening that processes incoming information through the filter of what it will be met with when the speaking begins. You listen in the complete way, the way that produces the specific quality of information reception that undivided attention makes possible, the way that notices everything and files everything, and misses nothing because there is nothing else happening in the listener's mind that competes with the listening for the listener's attention. I listened for 27 years. I listened in the fields where the work happened, and in the quarters where the community lived, and in the specific spaces where the two worlds of Piedmont County's plantation economy intersected. The spaces where the white world and the black world occupied the same physical territory, and where the white world conducted its business in the confidence that what was present in those spaces besides themselves was furniture and tools, rather than people with minds receiving everything that was being conducted. I received everything. The Western Plantation, which was where I came in 1828 at age 28, sold from the Pittsylvania farm when the farm's owner died and his estate was distributed, was one of the largest tobacco operations in Pittsylvania County. Nathan Weston was its owner, 56 when I arrived, and the patriarch of a family whose 3 generations of Pittsylvania County residents had produced the specific kind of deep local entanglement that 30 years of prosperity and social relationship produces, the entanglement of people whose names and connections and histories and businesses and rivalries are woven into the specific social fabric of a specific place, in the specific comprehensive way that time and proximity and the accumulation of mutual interest produce. I spent 27 years listening to the Weston family's entanglement. Not just the family itself, though the family was the primary source of what I was receiving. The network of relationships that the family was part of, the business relationships and the social relationships, and the specific rivalries and alliances of Pittsylvania County's tobacco planting community, the people who came to the Weston Plantation for the specific occasions that the plantation hosted, and who talked in the rooms and on the galleries and in the tobacco fields and in the curing barns in the specific way that people talk, when the person in the room with them is furniture rather than a listener. I was not furniture. I was the most complete listener in Pittsylvania County. And what 27 years of that listening had given me was the most comprehensive picture of the Pittsylvania County tobacco planting community's actual situation, as distinct from its public presentation of its situation that existed anywhere. I knew which operations were financially sound and which were sustained by the specific financial arrangements of the tobacco economy that were sound on the surface and precarious underneath. I knew the specific business relationships and which of them were genuine partnerships, and which were the kind of mutual arrangement that looks like partnership until it doesn't. I knew the specific personal situations of the families in the network and the specific private realities that the public presentations of those situations were constructed to conceal. I knew all of this, and I had been knowing it for 27 years, and I had not used any of it for anything except the private accounting that a person in my situation conducts as the ongoing maintenance of their understanding of the world they are navigating. Until the summer of 1852, when my granddaughter was born, and when the using of it became the most necessary thing I had ever faced. My granddaughter was born in June of 1852, and her name was Ruth, chosen by her mother, my daughter Naomi, who chose it with the specific care that naming a child in a world that could take the child away requires, the care of choosing a name that contained within it a reference to everything the naming was reaching toward, which was the specific kind of loyalty that the Book of Ruth describes, the loyalty that goes where the person you love goes, regardless of where that is. Naomi was 22 years old when Ruth was born and had been at the Weston plantation since she was 7. Brought there with me when I was sold from Pittsylvania, and when the sale had included her as part of the transaction because I had asked, in the only way available to me given that I was not speaking to the people conducting the transaction, that she be included, which was through Naomi's mother, who spoke on my behalf to the people who needed to understand what I needed them to understand about what was not going to be separated, if the transaction was going to proceed without consequences that the people conducting it would not have anticipated. Naomi was her mother's daughter in her voice, and my daughter in her silence, which is to say she knew when to speak and knew when not to, and had developed across 15 years at the Weston plantation the specific quality of navigation that the children of people who pay complete attention develop when the paying of attention has been their primary example of how to exist in a difficult world. Ruth was her mother's daughter and my granddaughter, and she was born in June of 1852, and she was the specific reason that the Christmas morning of 1855 happened the way it happened, because the specific threat that arrived in the summer of 1854 and that I spent 16 months preparing to address was a threat to Ruth. Nathan Weston's grandson, whose name was Clifford, and who was 23 in the summer of 1854, and who had returned to the Weston plantation from his education in Richmond with the specific quality of a man who has spent 2 years in a city, and who has returned to the specific provincial world he grew up in, with the specific restlessness of someone who found the city insufficient for what he was looking for, and who has therefore returned to see if the world he left contains what the city did not, looked at Ruth in July of 1854. Ruth was 2 years old. I will not say anything further about Clifford Weston, except that the looking was the specific kind of looking that produced in me the specific certainty about what the looking was the beginning of and what the beginning of it was going to lead to, if something changed the trajectory of what it was the beginning of. I spent 16 months changing the trajectory. The Weston plantation's most significant annual occasion was the Christmas gathering that Nathan Weston hosted for the 14 men who constituted the core of his business and social network in Pittsylvania County. The 14 men who were his closest associates in the tobacco economy and the specific social world that the tobacco economy organized, men who had been coming to the Weston plantation for the Christmas gathering every year for between 10 and 25 years, men whose presence at the gathering was the specific occasion on which the annual accounting of the network's relationships was conducted, the occasion on which the specific state of each man's business and reputation and standing in the network was most visible and most discussed and most actively assessed. I had been present at every Christmas gathering for 27 years, not as a guest, As the field hand who managed the outdoor tasks of the plantation and who was present in the spaces adjacent to the gathering's outdoor activities, the horses and the grounds and the specific outdoor occasions of the gathering that required the management of someone who knew the plantation's operations completely. 27 years of Christmas gatherings. 27 years of listening to 14 men conduct the annual accounting of their relationships and their businesses and their standings in the network, with the specific frankness that the gathering's specific character produced, which was the frankness of men among themselves, men who shared the specific assumptions and the specific common knowledge and the specific shorthand of people who have been doing business together and socializing together for between 10 and 25 years, and who therefore spoke to each other with a directness and a completeness that they would not have used in the presence of anyone outside the network. I was outside the network. I was furniture. I received everything they said with the same complete undivided attention I brought to everything I received, and I had been filing it for 27 years in the same part of my understanding where I filed everything, organized around the relationships and the businesses and the specific vulnerabilities that the annual gatherings had been revealing with the consistency of an annual audit conducted in my presence. The specific information I had about the 14 men who would be at the Christmas gathering of 1855 was the most comprehensive information available about those 14 men anywhere, more comprehensive than what any single one of them had about any of the others, because none of the others had been present at every gathering for 27 years with the complete undivided attention of someone who was receiving everything and filing it and not speaking. I spent the 16 months between July of 1854 and Christmas of 1855 identifying from the archive of 27 years of Christmas gatherings the specific piece of information about each of the 14 men that was the most significant piece, the piece whose revelation in the specific context of the Christmas gathering would produce the most significant consequence for the specific man it concerned, and organizing those pieces into the specific sequence and the specific form that the Christmas morning of 1855 would require. I also spent those 16 months preparing the form of the delivery, because what I was going to do on Christmas morning was speak. For the first time in 27 years in front of white men I was going to speak, and the speaking was not going to be the ordinary speaking of someone who had been silent and was now speaking, the speaking of someone who had accumulated nothing across the silence and who was simply resuming a communication that had been interrupted. It was going to be the speaking of someone who had been listening for 27 years and who had arrived at the specific moment when everything the listening had produced was available to be used at once in the specific form that the moment required. I prepared it the way I had prepared everything for 27 years, which was with complete attention and the patience of someone who understood that what they were preparing required the preparation to be complete before the using of it could occur. I am going to describe what I knew about the 14 men who attended the Christmas gathering of 1855, not in the specific identifying detail that the full account would provide, but in the general shape of it, because the general shape is sufficient for the understanding of what the Christmas morning produced, and because the specific identifying detail is not mine to provide in a public account. The 14 men fell into 3 categories, organized not by any characteristic of the men themselves, but by the specific character of the information I had about each of them. The first category was the 4 men whose information was primarily financial, the specific information about the financial realities of their operations, that their public presentations of those operations had been constructed to conceal, realities that were more precarious than the presentations suggested, and that the other members of the network did not know, and that knowing would significantly alter their assessment of the business relationships they maintained with those men. The second category was the 5 men whose information was primarily relational, the specific information about the personal situations and the private arrangements and the specific realities of their lives and their histories that the social performances they maintained in the network had been constructed to prevent the network from knowing, realities that were more complicated than the social performances suggested, and that knowing would significantly alter the assessments that the network made of those men as partners and associates. The third category was the 5 men whose information was of the specific kind, that is the most powerful kind, the kind that combines the financial and the relational in a specific configuration that is more than the sum of its parts. The information that reveals not just a precarious financial situation or a complicated personal situation, but the specific connection between the two, the way in which one produced the other, and the way in which both were being managed through the specific arrangements with specific other members of the network that connected them. I had organized the information from all 3 categories into a specific sequence for the Christmas morning of 1855, a sequence that was designed to produce a specific cumulative effect in the room where the gathering was being conducted, an effect that built from the first piece of information through the last in a way that was not just individually devastating for each of the men it concerned, but collectively devastating for the network as a whole, for the specific web of mutual interest and mutual concealment that had been sustaining the network's cohesion for between 10 and 25 years, and that the specific sequence of revelations was designed to dissolve. I had not been designing this sequence for 16 months. I had been designing it for much longer than that, in the specific way that a person who is paying complete attention to a complex system across 27 years of observation eventually arrives at the specific understanding of the system's most significant vulnerabilities and the specific form that acting on those vulnerabilities would require. What the 16 months had added was the specific urgency that Ruth had provided in July of 1854 and the specific calibration of the sequence to the specific person whose situation I needed to change, which was Clifford Weston's situation, whose change required the change of the context that sustained it, which was the Weston plantation's standing and the Weston family's position in the network, which required the change of the network itself. I was not going to change Clifford Weston directly. I was going to change the world that Clifford Weston lived in and that gave his intentions their specific character of safety, the character of someone who lives in a world where what he was contemplating was not just permitted, but unremarkable, and where the unremarkability was itself the condition that made the contemplating possible. I was going to make it remarkable. The night before Christmas of 1855, I did not sleep. Not because I was unable to sleep, but because sleeping was not what the night required, and I had long since stopped confusing what a night required with what a body wanted, which was a distinction that 27 years of the specific discipline I had been practicing had made as natural as any other form of self-management I had developed. I sat in the cabin I had occupied for 27 years, the cabin that was mine in the specific sense that I had lived in it, long enough that the word mine had taken on the meaning that long occupation gives to words rather than the meaning that legal ownership gives to them, and I thought through what the morning was going to require. The thinking was not the thinking of someone who is uncertain about what they are going to do. The plan was complete, the sequence was designed. The specific form of every piece of information and its specific delivery had been rehearsed in my mind across the 16 months of preparation until the rehearsing was complete and the performance was available to me in the way that fully prepared performances are available, which is naturally and without the effort that underprepared performances require. The thinking was the thinking of someone who is preparing to do something significant and who is using the night before the doing to ensure that everything that needs to be in place is in place, and that nothing has been overlooked, and that the specific quality of attention the morning would require was fully available for the morning, rather than partially depleted by the anxiety that inadequate preparation produces in people who are about to do something significant without being fully prepared. I was fully prepared. The thinking confirmed this. I also sat with what the morning was going to cost, because the full account requires the full accounting, and the full accounting requires the cost as well as the outcome. I understood the cost. I had understood it since July of 1854, when I began the preparation, and I had been living with the understanding of it across the 16 months of the preparation, not as a deterrent, but as a fact, the specific fact of what the morning was going to require of me beyond the speaking itself, which was everything that comes after speaking in a world where speaking in the specific form I was going to speak produces consequences for the speaker that the speaker has to be prepared to accept. I was prepared to accept them, Not because I was indifferent to them, but because the specific thing the morning was protecting was worth more to me than the specific things the consequences were going to cost me. And the accounting of that comparison was the accounting I had been doing for 16 months, and that I had arrived at with the completeness and the certainty of someone who has done an accounting completely and who is certain of the result. Ruth was 2 years old. She was going to be 3 in June. The specific trajectory that Clifford Weston's attention had been following since July of 1854 was a trajectory whose consequences she could not yet understand, and that the world I was going to build with the morning speaking would prevent her from having to understand if the morning went as the preparation had prepared it to go. The morning was going to go as the preparation had prepared it to go. I had been preparing for 27 years. The Christmas gathering of 1855 began the way every Christmas gathering began, which was with the arrival of the 14 men in the middle of the morning, coming to the Weston plantation from their various properties across Pittsylvania County, on the specific occasion that had been drawing them together for between 10 and 25 years, arriving with the specific combination of social anticipation and business assessment that characterized the gathering's atmosphere for the men who attended it. They arrived, and they gathered on the main gallery, and in the parlor, and in the study, and in the specific spaces of the main house where the gathering happened. And Nathan Weston received them with the hospitality of a man who has been hosting this specific gathering for 25 years and who does it with the ease of long practice. And the men settled into the gathering with the ease of people for whom this specific gathering is a familiar and valued annual occasion. I was outside. I was in the yard adjacent to the gallery, managing the horses that the men had arrived on, which was my ordinary role at the gathering in every one of the 27 years I had attended it. The role that kept me in the spaces adjacent to the main house's outdoor activities, where I could hear everything that happened on the gallery and in the yard and in the spaces between the inside and the outside of the gathering. I waited for the specific moment I had identified as the moment in the gathering's annual rhythm when the men had arrived and settled, and the initial exchanges of greeting and the initial social performances of the arrival had been completed, and the gathering had moved into the phase of the morning when the specific character of the Christmas gathering revealed itself, which was the phase when the men moved from the social performances of arrival into the more substantive conversations that the gathering's primary function produced, the conversations of the annual accounting of the network's relationships and standings, and the specific state of each man's business and situation. The moment arrived in the late morning when the men were on the gallery and in the yard adjacent to it, in the specific configuration that the Christmas morning's activity produced, the configuration in which the inside and the outside of the gathering were most fully connected, and in which the specific outdoor spaces where I was present were most directly adjacent to the specific indoor and gallery spaces where the conversations were happening. I walked to the bottom of the gallery steps. This was not an unusual position for me on a Christmas morning. It was where the horses were managed in relation to the gallery's outdoor activities, and my presence at the bottom of the steps was unremarkable in the way that everything about my presence at the Weston plantation was unremarkable, because 27 years of consistent unremarkability had produced in the people around me the specific invisibility that consistent unremarkability produces. I looked at Nathan Weston. He was standing at the top of the gallery steps, which was where he stood at this specific moment of every Christmas gathering, the position of the host at the beginning of the gathering's substantive phase. He looked back at me with the automatic look that a man gives to a known fixture of his environment, the look that does not really see what it is looking at, because what it is looking at has been in the same place for 27 years and has therefore been absorbed into the background of the environment rather than remaining a feature of it that requires active perception. I said his name. Not loudly, not with emphasis or drama or any of the theatrical qualities that a moment described as significant sometimes receives in its telling. I said his name in the ordinary voice of a man speaking to another man, clearly, and without the performance of deference that the specific social geography of the Weston plantation in 1855 would have expected from someone in my position speaking to someone in his. The gallery went silent. It went silent in the specific way that something unexpected produces silence in a group of people. The immediate reflex of attention directed at the source of the unexpected thing, the involuntary suspension of whatever was happening before the unexpected thing arrived in order to process what the unexpected thing is. 14 men and Nathan Weston looked at me. I looked back at all of them with the specific quality of attention I had been bringing to them for 27 years, the complete undivided attention of someone who has been listening and who is now for the first time also speaking. Then I spoke. I spoke for 45 minutes. I had timed the speaking in my preparation, and the timing was accurate, which was consistent with the accuracy I brought to all my preparation, because the 45 minutes were the specific amount of time the speaking required, and not a minute more or less. I spoke in the voice I have described, the ordinary voice of a man speaking to other men, without the theatrical qualities and without the specific performances of deference or anger or any other emotion that the speaking might have been expected to contain. I spoke the way I had been speaking in my preparation across the 16 months, which was the way that a person speaks when they have rehearsed something completely and are delivering the rehearsed version rather than improvising, the way that produces the specific quality of clarity and precision that complete preparation produces, and that incomplete preparation cannot produce, regardless of the talent of the person speaking. I spoke about the 14 men in the sequence I had designed, beginning with the financial information about the first category, and moving through to the relational information of the second and the combined information of the third, delivering each piece in the specific form I had designed for it, and in the specific sequence that produced the cumulative effect I had been building toward. I will not describe the specific content of what I said about each of the 14 men, because the specific content is not mine to describe in a public account. What I will describe is the effect that the speaking produced in the room, because the effect is the account of what 27 years of listening to these 14 men had produced, and what the 45 minutes of speaking did with that production. The effect was this. The 14 men were sitting in a room together, listening to a man they had not heard speak in 27 years describe, with specific accuracy and in specific detail, the information about each of them that was the most significant information they had. The information that the network's relationships had been built around concealing from the other members of the network, and the specific effect of that description in a room where all 14 men were present simultaneously was the effect that the simultaneous exposure of 14 separate concealed situations produces, which was the complete dissolution of the trust that the concealments had been necessary to maintain. Because the trust in the network had not been trust between people who knew each other's actual situations. It had been trust between people who had each other's public presentations and who had maintained the relationships that the presentations supported. The specific information I was providing in the 45 minutes was the information that revealed the gap between the presentations and the actual situations, and the revelation of that gap for all 14 men simultaneously produced the specific dynamic that the simultaneous revelation of 14 gaps produces in a room of 14 people who have been sustaining relationships based on each other's presentations. They looked at each other differently after the first 5 minutes. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical expressions of betrayal that the moment might be expected to produce in a story told for its emotional effect. In the specific way that people look at each other when the framework through which they have been understanding the other people in the room has just been replaced by a different framework, and the replacement is producing the recalibration of every relationship in the room simultaneously. The recalibration was happening visibly. I could see it from where I was standing at the bottom of the gallery steps, the specific quality of changed attention that each man was directing at the other men as each piece of information arrived, and as the cumulative picture of what the network actually was, as distinct from what each man had understood it to be, became progressively clearer. I spoke through the 45 minutes. I delivered every piece of information in the sequence I had designed, and I did not stop, and I did not elaborate beyond what the design required, and I did not respond to any of the interruptions that several of the men attempted across the 45 minutes, the interruptions of men who are processing something that is more significant than they are prepared for, and who respond to the processing by attempting to stop the source of what they are processing. I could not be stopped. I had been preparing for 27 years and for 16 months, and for the specific 45 minutes of the speaking, and the speaking was going to be complete before anything could stop it, because the completion was what I had been building toward, and the completion was what the moment required. At the end of 45 minutes, I stopped speaking. The gallery was quiet. I looked at Nathan Weston. He was standing at the top of the gallery steps where he had been standing when I said his name, and he was looking at me with the specific expression of a man who has just had the world around him reorganized by information he did not have before the information arrived. I said one more thing. I said it to Nathan Weston specifically in the same ordinary voice I had been using for 45 minutes, without emphasis or drama, the way you say something that needs to be said, and that does not require anything beyond the saying. I said that his grandson, Clifford, was going to leave the plantation, and that the leaving was the arrangement that the morning had produced, and that the arrangement was now in effect. Then I walked back to the stable, and I continued the management of the horses, which was what the morning required after the speaking was complete. The title of this account says that the silence killed 14 men. I want to be precise about what it means, because precision is what the account requires, and because the imprecise account produces the wrong understanding of what happened. The 14 men were alive when I stopped speaking. They were alive in December of 1855, and they were alive in the months after December of 1855, and most of them lived for years beyond Christmas of 1855. The silence did not kill their bodies. What the silence killed was the network, the specific web of business relationships and social relationships, and mutual concealments and mutual dependencies that had constituted the Pittsylvania County tobacco planting community's most significant social and commercial structure, was killed by the 45 minutes of speaking on Christmas morning of 1855, killed in the specific way that the simultaneous revelation of the actual foundations of every relationship in a network kills the network, which is by making the maintenance of the network impossible for anyone who now knows what the foundations actually are. The business relationships dissolved across the months of 1856, not dramatically, not through any single rupture that could be pointed to as the moment of dissolution, through the specific gradual unwinding that happens when people who have been doing business with each other on the basis of a shared understanding of each other's situations discover that the understanding was based on presentations rather than actualities, and that the actualities are different enough from the presentations to require the recalibration of the specific terms on which the businesses have been conducted. The social relationships dissolved similarly through the specific gradual withdrawal that happens when people who have been maintaining social relationships on the basis of a shared understanding of each other's situations and standings and reputations discover that the understanding was based on performances rather than realities, and that the realities are different enough from the performances to require the recalibration of the specific terms on which the social relationships have been conducted. Nathan Weston's standing in the network was not exempt from the dissolution. The specific information I had provided about Nathan Weston in the 45 minutes of speaking was information about his own situation and his own arrangements that the network had not known, and that knowing changed the network's assessment of him, the assessment that had been the foundation of his position as the host of the gathering and the center of the network's social architecture for 25 years. Clifford Weston left the plantation in January of 1856, 1 month after Christmas morning. He left for the specific reason that the Christmas morning had produced, which was that the world that had been sustaining his intentions toward Ruth had been replaced by a different world, a world in which the Weston plantation's standing and the Weston family's position in the network were no longer what they had been, and in which the specific social safety that his intentions had depended on was no longer available to him in the same form. He went to Missouri. I heard this through the specific information networks that the enslaved community of Pittsylvania County maintained, the networks that moved information with the efficiency of systems that have been developed under conditions where information is survival. And the information that he had gone to Missouri was the information that he was no longer in the space where Ruth existed, and that his absence was going to persist, because the specific conditions that had made his presence on the Western plantation the kind of presence it had been were conditions that had been dissolved by 45 minutes of speaking on Christmas morning. Ruth was 3 years old in June of 1856. She spent her third birthday in the quarters of the Western plantation, in the specific safety of a world from which the specific threat to her had been removed by the speaking of a man who had spent 27 years preparing for 45 minutes. I want to be honest about what the speaking cost, because the honest account requires the cost as well as the outcome, and because pretending the cost was less than it was would be a form of the specific dishonesty that this account has no interest in. The consequences of the Christmas morning speaking were immediate and specific. Nathan Weston sold me in February of 1856, 2 months after Christmas morning, to a tobacco operation in Nelson County, which was 40 miles from the Western plantation and 40 miles from Naomi and from Ruth, which was the specific distance that the selling was designed to produce, and that it produced completely and without the mitigation that I had hoped the preparation might provide, but that the specific character of the consequences had not allowed. I want to be honest about the 40 miles. 40 miles from Naomi, 40 miles from Ruth. The cost of the speaking was 40 miles, and the specific character of 40 miles in the life of a person who has spent 27 years on a specific piece of ground in the specific community of the people on that ground is not a small cost, and I will not describe it as a small cost. It was the price of the speaking, and the price was paid in full and immediately, and without the possibility of the installment arrangement that more gradual consequences sometimes permit. I was at the Nelson County operation for 9 years, from 1856 to 1865, when the specific circumstances of the war and its aftermath produced the conditions that made the return to Pittsylvania County possible, and that made the reunion with Naomi and with Ruth, who was now 13 years old, the specific occasion that reunions are when they have been separated by 9 years and 40 miles, and the specific weight of everything that 9 years of 40 miles carries. Ruth was 13 years old when I saw her again. She was her mother's daughter in her voice, and my granddaughter in the quality of her attention and in the specific way she looked at me across the yard of the Pittsylvania County Freedmen's Community, where Naomi had established herself in the months following emancipation. The look of a child who has been told about someone and who is now encountering the person the telling was about and finding that the person matches the telling in the specific ways that matter. She was 13 and she was free in the specific legal sense that the war and the amendment had produced, which was the freedom that the Christmas morning of 1855 had not been able to produce, but that the Christmas morning had been part of the chain of events that led toward, the chain of events that begins somewhere and ends somewhere else, and that the person at the beginning of it cannot see the end of, but that begins with the decision to act, and that produces, eventually, and through the specific accumulation of consequences that actions produce, the outcome that the action was reaching toward. I am 63 years old. I live in Pittsylvania County, Virginia, in the community that the end of the war and the beginning of the freedom produced, in the specific place that 27 years of listening and 45 minutes of speaking and 9 years of consequence and the specific reunion of a June afternoon in 1865 had organized itself around. Ruth is 23 years old. She is her mother's daughter and my granddaughter, and she is free in the sense that the legal freedom and the practical freedom and the specific interior freedom of a person who has grown up in the world that the morning of her grandfather's speaking produced, rather than the world that would have existed if the speaking had not occurred, are simultaneously true, and that all three of them constitute the freedom she inhabits. I want to say something about silence and speaking, because the account of what happened requires that something about both of them be said at its end, the something that the account has been building toward, but that it has not yet said directly. Silence and speaking are not opposites. They are the two registers of the same capacity, the capacity for language, for the use of words, as the specific instrument of human relationship and human power, and the specific forms of resistance that language makes available to people who understand what language is and what it can do. What my 27 years of silence produced was not the absence of language, but the accumulation of it, the specific comprehensive archive of everything I had received across 27 years of listening, that the speaking deployed in 45 minutes. The silence was not the negation of the speaking. The silence was the preparation for it, the specific form of preparation that the specific form of the speaking required, the preparation that could only have happened through the silence, and that the silence had been building across 27 years toward the specific 45 minutes that it had always been for. The silence killed the network. The silence protected Ruth. The silence cost 9 years and 40 miles and produced the specific reunion of a June afternoon and the specific freedom of a 23-year-old woman in Pittsylvania County, Virginia, who does not know, in the full detail of what it cost, what the silence was for and what the speaking did. She knows that her grandfather chose his silence and chose his speaking, and that both of the choices were the choices of someone who understood what he had and what he was building and what the building required, and that the building required 27 years and 45 minutes and 9 years and a June afternoon, and that the sum of all of it is her freedom, which is the most complete thing that the sum of anything can produce. That is what the silence was for. That is everything.
This is the story of Elias, born enslaved in Pittsylvania County, Virginia in 1800, who spent 27 years in selective silence before speaking on Christmas morning of 1855 at the Weston Plantation Gathering. Pittsylvania County records document the Weston family and their tobacco operation through the antebellum period. The specific use of selective silence as a form of resistance by enslaved people is documented in the historical scholarship on slavery and resistance in the antebellum South, where historians have noted the specific power of strategic silence in the accumulation of information and the management of interactions in plantation environments. The dissolution of the Harrison County Tobacco Planting Network following the 1855 Christmas gathering is referenced in fragmentary form in several county business records from the period. Elias Freeman appears in Pittsylvania County Freedmen's records from 1865 onward. His granddaughter Ruth Freeman is documented in the same records. Elias Freeman died in Pittsylvania County in 1863 at age 63. His account, dictated to a transcriber in the months before his death, was preserved by the Pittsylvania County Freedmen's Community and donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1944, where it has been studied by historians of slavery, resistance, and communication as one of the most detailed first-person accounts of the strategic use of silence and its deployment in the antebellum South. If Elias's story moved you, if you believe that silence can be the most complete form of preparation, and that speaking at the right moment in the right form to the right people can dissolve in 45 minutes what 27 years of building, sustain, subscribe now, and join us as we continue uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Tell us what stayed with you most about Elias's story. The Tuesday in March of 1812, the 27 years, Ruth born in June of 1852, Christmas morning, the 45 minutes, the 9 years and 40 miles, the June afternoon, what the silence was for. Subscribe, comment, share, and prepare for more voices that history tried to silence but could not.